So in order, though, to do that, in order to be a parent, to meet a child's needs, to be able to catch them when they fall, we need to anticipate them when they're going to fall. Now that's a different challenge altogether as a parent, is to anticipate them when they're going to fall. Look with me at what Jesus says here in Matthew chapter 19 regarding children. Matthew chapter 19, verse 13. Jesus says, "Then the children were brought to him that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked the people, but Jesus said, 'Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven.' And he laid his hands on them and went away." What I want you to think about is the tenderness with which Jesus dealt with the children present. And laying his hands on them, he took time for them. Time, I've said before, I'll say it again, time is the most valuable thing any human being possesses, because we did not set the beginning of our time, and we will not be able to dictate the end of our time. The psalmist says our days are numbered. And it's true. We don't know what the number of our days is. Something else that I've been thinking about, I'll be 42 this fall in September. My grandfather died at the age of 42. Now, I'm not saying I'm planning on dying, but it does, when you pass that. I know my two older cousins, my dad, his brothers, when they passed that age of 42, it was like, what's going to happen this year? There's a little bit of that apprehension in their minds. And I have to say, there's a little apprehension in my mind. You know, I do realize that there are things that are different in my life from my grandfather's, but I thought about it, what would happen if my children only remember me to the age of 42? How would they remember me? Would I have met their needs? Would I have been the father that they needed? Would I have cared enough to warn them about the pitfalls of life? One of the things that I enjoy about having teenagers is that we get to have almost adult conversations. There are times when I can now relate to my children on an adult level, where they're asking questions that are, not that my children ask stupid questions, okay? I don't want to imply that. They say there's no such thing as a stupid question. But sometimes my younger children, why is the sky blue? And I'm not my father-in-law. My father-in-law would have gone into great details to what made the sky appear to be blue. But I'm not my father-in-law. I'm like, because God made it blue. That's my general answer. So, if you've got a better answer for that, share it with me, and I'll tell my kids the next time one of the little ones says, "Why is the sky blue?" I'll share the answer. But so we've had some really great conversations in the recent past with some of the older kids as they grow up and learn to navigate life. The conversation is very, very good. I want to look at what Solomon says in Proverbs chapter 6. As we talk to our children about life, we need to warn them about the pitfalls, the potential problem places in life, so that they don't make the same mistakes that we make. And I know that it's been said by people that when I was 6, Dad knew everything. When I was 16, Dad knew nothing. When I was 26, Dad was okay again. We make fun of that. But as parents, whether or not our children listen, and one of the things I've noticed is that they may not act like they're listening, but they really are. Our young people's minds are like a sponge, and they absorb things. Solomon in Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 20 says, "My son, keep your father's commandment, and forsake not your mother's teaching. Bind them on your heart always, and tie them around your neck." Solomon's encouraging his son to remember the things that he's been taught. And our children tend to do that. They may not acknowledge that we're right. They may not acknowledge that we have information that they can use. But someday down the road, they're going to be in a situation and they'll remember something that mom or dad has told them. Solomon says, "When you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk with you." And that certainly is true. There are times when we may be dead and gone, that our words will talk to our children years from now. Also, something we need to do is encourage our children to do what is right. Now, this can be challenging because our children want to live their own lives. But, this was something in Deuteronomy chapter 11. This is a fascinating passage that God told Moses to write down for the children of Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 11, and in verse 18 of that chapter, Moses records for us what God is asking. He says, "You shall therefore lay up these words of mine in your hearts and in your soul." He's talking to the children of Israel. Before they come into the promised land, they're to store up. Your King James Version might even say, to store up these words in your heart and in your soul. "You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes." I would say maybe if Moses were talking to us today, instead of frontlets, Moses might say they might be tattooed on your hand, and they might be as glasses on your eyes. That might be the wording that Moses would use in speaking to us today. But notice with me verse 19. This is very important, parents, because if we teach our children, Solomon in the book of Proverbs, remember we began this study, train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. Most of what our children learn, most of what you and I learned, was learned at a very early age. We've expanded that knowledge, we've grown that knowledge, but our basic characteristic is formed before we're 6 years old, before we actually, even our school age, our basic characteristics are formed. Something that I appreciate, even though my dad was Catholic and I was raised in the Catholic Church, something I appreciated was my grandmother, who took time to do exactly what Moses is talking about here in verse 19. "You shall teach them to your children. All of the ways of God you shall teach to your children, talking of them when you are sitting in your house, and when you are walking by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds like a pretty constant reminder. And so we have tried our very best to talk about God with our children in all places, in all times, in all situations. When we go to play, we talk about God. You can talk about God in any situation. And children will retain that. They'll listen to that. Now, in verse 20, I love verse 20. Growing up, we had a neighbor who was really, really good friends with my grandmother. This lady had grown up in the church, but had drifted away from the church. She never became a Christian, even though she'd grown up in the church. Her husband was raised by a family that was not members of the church, and he studied the Word of God. He picked up the Bible one day and began to read, and he read this passage about the words of God. He says, You shall write them on your doorpost of your house and on your gates. Now, I'm going to pause there, and I want to tell you what Ray Franks did. And I never knew Ray Franks. He died before I was born, but I knew his wife, Edna. Edna Franks, she milked a small herd of dairy cattle until she was 88 years old. At the age of 88, she switched to beef cattle. She ran beef cattle for the next 4 years until she passed at 92. But I would go up there as a child, and I would help Edna milk cows. I loved helping Edna. It was before we were milking cows, so I loved helping Edna milk cows. And but something struck me. To this very day, if you would go up to the Edna Franks farm, the buildings that are still standing, every building at the gable had a Bible verse. Some of them were at the gable, sometimes over the door. Ray Franks had little metal signs made up. And every building had a Bible verse that might pertain to that building. There was one on one building that said, is the passage regarding seed time and harvest. That was on the grain. There was another one that said the section in Songs about the cattle on the 1,000 hills. You know, and on the gate to their house, there was a little metal sign. The gate to the yard, little metal sign. I don't remember what that one said. But I remember as a child, I couldn't read, but I'd point up and I'd say, what's that one say? And Edna would read it to me. She didn't become a Christian until she was 88 years old. At the age of 88, she obeyed the gospel. Her husband had been a Christian for years, and she had never obeyed the gospel. But one day, Edna was talking with my grandmother on the telephone. My grandmother had cancer, so it would have been about 1993. My grandmother had cancer, and they talked every day on the telephone. Edna would call to see how she was doing. And Edna, I remember hearing the conversation. She said, I wonder what the Lord is keeping me here for. All of my family's gone. My husband's dead. My parents are dead. My brothers are dead. My sisters are dead. She said, I just don't understand, Wyona. Wyona was my grandmother's name. She said, I just don't understand, Wyona, why the Lord is keeping me here. My grandmother said, well, Edna, there's probably something you still need to do. God's not through with you yet. She said, have you thought about becoming a Christian? And there was just silence on the phone. I was there a couple of days later when Edna called up again, and she began the conversation with, well, Wyona, I went and done. Grandma goes, went and done what? She said, I got baptized. I became a Christian yesterday. And I remember that conversation so well. And I remember the impact that her husband, even though I never met him while he was living, had on my life in this particular passage. So there are times and there are places where we can bring up God's word to our children.